Thank you, Sharat. And I really liked what Comrade Shankar had to say. He's covered Lenin very thoroughly. So I don't have a slide presentation. I'll read from my notes, which I prepared. So you just have to listen to me. And I'll try to keep it short since Lenin has been covered so thoroughly. One thing I want to say is leaders are products of their movements and times. And in turn, they influence the movements. And Vladimir Lenin was an exceptional one that the great proletarian revolution produced. Lenin, of course, was born in 1870 in a middle-class Russian family. But most of his work was in the first quarter of the 20th century, the period of global capitalist crisis. And so it started in Russian Revolution. It started, so this great proletarian revolution started with 175 million people of the Russian Empire. That included 100 million of the oppressed nations of ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, whose language and culture was brutally suppressed by the Tsarist system. In that sense, in India also, the lower caste actually formed the majority of the population. There's a similarity, there's a parallel here. So this great proletarian revolutionary movement then extended to a large part of the globe throughout the rest of the 20th century, even as it weakened in its own place of birth. So now Martin Luther King, the black man, which is term for African Americans I would like to use in this talk, was son of a Baptist Christian minister. So he too came from the middle class. King indirectly was also a product of the revolutionary movement that began in far-off Russia around 1900 and came to the US. That revolutionary movement came to the US both by the communist movement in the US, the black revolutionaries who studied Marx and Lenin, but it was also given a boost with the return of the black soldiers from Second World War. They had guns and they had fought against the white soldiers, just as their ancestors had in the Civil War as part of the Northern Army when they were freed by Lincoln. More importantly, they had military training. So oppressed as they were, now there is a section which is willing to fight with guns. Blacks who were largely sharecroppers in the fields of the old slave landowners after the Civil War were proletarianized with the rise of industrial mechanized large-scale farming. And of them, many had moved to the north. A small petty bourgeois class was emerging in the black population, but racism and oppression held them back. It is in this post-Second World War period that King lived, when capitalism had recovered from its crisis and US had become the workshop of the world, the most prosperous country and the sole new imperialist capitalist power in the world. So Lenin's time and Ambedkar's time overlap. They're part of the first half of the century. Lenin actually dies in 1924, so it's only the first quarter. Ambedkar time goes further. So he's in the second quarter. He's active in the second quarter mostly. In case of King, it's a big separation. King was active in the 1960s, or maybe a little late 50s and 60s. King was assassinated at age 39 in 1969. He was born in 1929. King achieved advancement in civil rights movement for the black oppressed minorities. But unlike Ambedkar in India, who was the undisputed leader of the Dalits in India, King was not the sole representative in the black movement of 1960s. African Americans, blacks that is, were legally freed from slavery in January 1863 by President Lincoln during the Civil War. Lincoln was assassinated a week after the end of the Civil War by an assassin sent by the slave owners of the South who had lost the war. With Lincoln gone, Northern white ruling class compromised with this reactionary Southern slave-owning capitalist class. This resulted in the blacks to remain marginalized and kept poor by the promulgation of the laws in Southern states that reduced their rights. In a sense, they are the fourth caste, the Dalits of the United States in that sense. Those who moved north worked in factories at the bottom of the work ladder, just like the Dalits in India did and do, and lived in the urban slums, excluded from skilled trade unions, the racism being just as ingrained in the North as it was in the South. So they were excluded from trade unions by white workers. Lenin and King are thus not contemporaries. It's very difficult to compare and find common ground, but there are, and I'll go there. What can be said as a common between Lenin and King, whose acknowledged inspiration was Gandhi, is that they shared this in their approaches. To bring about a radical change in society, participation of the broadest swath of masses is necessary. In Russia, workers were a small minority. And in the US, African Americans, or the blacks, were a small minority. Both needed support from the majority. In Russia, it was the peasant masses that constituted over 80% of the population. And in the US, white workers constituted a similar majority. So that's sort of common between the two. But they are in different times and they have different goals. For Gandhi and King, nonviolence was sacrosanct and was a method of struggle. It was appropriate in what goal they had in mind. The nonviolent civil rights movement appealed to morality and decency of the majority whites in the US, particularly the liberals in the North. And in the case of India, the Gandhi-led movement appealed to the ruling British colonialists and liberal citizens of Britain, and it mobilized Indian masses on that basis. But both Gandhi, King and Gandhi, as leaders of movements whose goal they themselves limited. So they did not have the same goal as the Russian Revolution led by Lenin. There is a vast difference. Unlike Lenin, they did not seek to achieve a historical overturn. That is, overthrow of the rule of a tiny minority over the vast majority. There was the feudal class and later the capitalist class and colonial bondage that much of the country was under a few rich capitalist countries in those days. And make those who never had power, in the case of Russia, the workers and oppressed, the ruling class. So Lenin's canvas was vastly larger. King had support among liberals in the North. He inspired many idealistic white youths in the northern states to go to southern states to help blacks register to vote, who were given the legal right to vote, but were prevented from registering to vote by the white power structure. But when these idealistic white youth went there, they were arrested and thrown in jails. King's movement's association with liberals in the North achieved some gains for a section of the Black population. That's an important gain, who advanced to middle class, but it left the party in poverty and misery to this day, dominated by the state, police killing of innocent Blacks, as well as recorded fact. Having said that, there's more about King's himself moving from that position, and I'll come to that. In the US, one who began to see the connection between misery of the Black population and the system of capitalist exploitation, first among the Black leaders after the Second World War, was Malcolm X. Malcolm was also born in a Baptist minister's family, just like King. It was in Omaha, Nebraska, which is in the Midwest of the United States. King was born in the South. His father was, Malcolm X's father was a black nationalist and was murdered by the white racists. He joined Nation of Islam. He converted to Islam that taught black separatism and black nationalism. But later he was disillusioned and left and found his own mosque. So he remained a Muslim. Malcolm X, not formally a Marxist, but in class terms, represented the black workers, and he was very radical. So you have to leave aside the fact that both King were Christian and he was Muslim. That doesn't matter. In this case, he represented the proletarians, black proletarians in the slums of northern cities who suffered both exploitation at work and racial oppression, both around by other citizens and particularly by the state. Malcolm X understood the nature of the state. So that is one thing that is in Malcolm, that he understood the nature of the state in the US, which Lenin has defined in his work, and of course starts with Marx. So the state used violence to maintain the order that oppressed the Black Americans. This is the understanding in the Black movement that came from Malcolm X. Malcolm X was also assassinated in 1965 as he began to connect the conditions of the Black in the US to the international relations of the US with other countries, particularly African countries. Now here by state, we mean the system of governance in society, the government, the media, the security forces, and the judicial penal system. King, too, in 1968, now this is later part of his life, began to see the class oppression. This is 3 years after Malcolm dies. He went in February 1968 to support the Memphis sanitation workers who were seeking recognition of their union. They formed a union, were looking for recognition, which city was refusing. He took a firm stand in their support as proletarians who had a right to a recognized union, which the white mayor of Memphis denied. A section of white students joined in support of the union demand. So now it is becoming a class agitation, in which black and whites are, which is very threatening. About the same time, it's threatening to the ruling power structure. About the same time, he also connected exploitation and oppression at home in the US to the wars and aggression of the US capitalism abroad. At that time, it was the Vietnam War, and in which Americans were drafted, sent out. I myself was subject to that draft, which I did not had to go. So Malcolm also, Martin Luther King also, like Malcolm X, was assassinated soon after, as he took the international position and opposed US imperialism. It's a very interesting parallel how they both died. Both were taking class position sharply. Both were coming out and connecting it to imperialism. So I now return to Lenin's time, and I have to say much less because Comrade Shankar has covered it quite a lot, which is a period 70 years earlier than that of Martin Luther King. Imperial Russia in the 19th century was a tyrannical feudal militarist empire in which capitalism was rising, but where capital and Tsar's policies were controlled by Britain and France. Two, as Shankar said, that it was a backward capitalist country. So these two well-established colonial imperialist powers had investments that control even the policies of the Tsarist government. Now, Lenin was forced out of Russia and had to live in exile in France and Switzerland after 1905 revolution, which failed, and a great deal of reaction. And the Bolsheviks who were part of it were hunted. And the Tsarist police knew who was the brain behind, by now, who was the acknowledged leader of the working class, the proletarians, the Bolsheviks. So he, while completely upholding Marx's work, so he lived in Europe, in France, in Switzerland. He actually was Switzerland before he returned to Russia. And he knew, so while completely upholding, so he lived there, but he was not disconnected from the working class of Russia. He used to publish, and their publication, his party sent him information, and workers kept coming. Actually, Krupskaya and her mother, who lived together with Lenin, used to get up late at night if some worker came, because they used to be so hungry that they were almost going insane, and they will first cook the food to feed him and calm him down. And Lenin would be up and trying to feed him, calm him down, and then they will talk. So Lenin was completely integrated with the working people of Russia, even though he was in Switzerland. While completely upholding Marx's work in the 19th century, Lenin extended and applied it in the context of a changed reality of the 20th century. He analyzed it in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. It was published in 1916. Capitalism, Lenin concluded, had reached the monopoly stage, which Comrade Shankar has mentioned. A handful of rich countries had in their stranglehold the vast majority of the population of the world living in misery in the colonized and semi-colonized countries, whom these rich capitalist countries oppressed and super exploited for huge profits. Under this condition, and in this rotten stage of capital, which Lenin termed imperial stage, highest stage of imperialism, capitalism had lost its earlier creative, if bloody, dynamism. The competing world imperialist countries were now fighting in a dogfight in a world war to redivide the world among themselves. And that's what Lenin describes in imperialism. The world has been divided. All these cartels have been formed. The finance has emerged as a powerful center, and finance and industrialists and financiers are integrated. So Lenin came to the conclusion that the revolution will occur in the weakest link, which Comrade Shankar has mentioned, in the chain of imperial. That was the Tsarist Russian Empire. So the question was finding a path for it. So there, Lenin's other path-breaking work is State and Revolution, in which he expanded on Marx's own teaching on the state, that it was an instrument of violence on behalf of the ruling classes. It was the capitalist class behind the Tsarist despotism, and that is even foreign capitalist class. The examples of white youth thrown in jails during the civil rights movement here in the United States in the 1960s, and the continuous killing of Black men in the US cities all the way down to this day, even under Obama, a Black man who was the president, validates Lenin's thesis on the nature of capitalist state, okay, and its violent character. Lenin concluded that the workers, upon gaining power as the ruling class, could not use the state that existed before the revolution, that workers could just take over and run the society. And this also comes from Marx. He developed it further. Instead, the new ruling class of workers with peasant alliance had to build a completely new one from scratch. And this is what his study of both imperialism and of his State and Revolution brought him to, the alliance with peasantry, because under imperialism, much of the Russian peasantry had really no place to go. The capitalist system was not improving their conditions. That is, vast majority of peasants, leaving aside a few, which were the rich peasants, which is a small section, maybe 5%. So the old state had to be destroyed to its foundations. Lenin concluded in State and Revolution. The state here means system of government and all. I've already defined that. Lenin's thinking on ethnic minorities was the other one, which is the 100 million out of 175 million, roughly equivalent to the lower castes in India today. It's a paddle. He developed that thinking, and then Stalin is the one who developed it further. And he published in his book, Marxism and the National and Colonial Question in 1913. So this is the third element of Bolshevik worker class struggle on a basis of workers against capitalists. Second is alliance with peasantry. The third is attitude towards the oppressed minorities, which basically were the people in peasant society. Revisionism and many other factors are responsible for the retreat of the socialist movement after 1960, but the great global proletarian revolution is now dispersed and submerged in form. The period the world entered in 1990 onwards, after Russian socialism dissolved and China took to capitalist mode of production, I think is a period great Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci described as the interregnum. I think COVID-19, economic crisis of 2001, in 2000, 7 years ago, the MERS and Ebola epidemic, all in the last 18 years is sign of that interregnum. Seems to me a period between two eras, one ending, the other of global revolution springing forward from their submerged conditions. So that's where we are. And I agree with Comrade Shankar that the rottenness of American capitalism is exposed by the enormous suffering people are going under in COVID-19. If you compare that to China, South Korea, Taiwan, and up to now even India, which is also a rotten society of capitalism. But it is perhaps not as rotten as the stage that American capitalism has reached. That may be debatable, but that's is a possibility. Anyway, I end my presentation at this point. Thank you.